So the right of people to resist unjust governments is immutable. It's inalienable, and it's been recognized for thousands of years. Certainly the ancient Romans, the ancient Athenians, the ancient Spartans, they supported the right of resistance against tyranny. And, you could even go back to like the Epic of Gilgamesh, where Gilgamesh was tyrannizing over the people of Uruk, and in Sumer, or in was it either Sumer or Acadia, or Babylon. But Gilgamesh basically, I believe it was still Sumerian at that time. He was tyrannizing over the people, and they got sick of it, and they brought in Enkidu, I believe, the wild man from the jungle or from the forests, to basically either overthrow Gilgamesh or put Gilgamesh in check. And ultimately Enkidu became bosom pals and possibly lovers with Gilgamesh, but he may have tempered some of the tyranny as well in the process. But at least, we see an instance of the people uniting against a tyrannical leader. And, I'm sure there are instances of, like, as old as tyranny has been, that's probably how old the resistance against tyranny is. And I've studied a lot of the Scottish tradition, kind of branch of the tradition of resistance. So certainly in Scotland, a lot of kings were overthrown, a lot of monarchs were overthrown throughout the centuries. And like, I think one of the best books on that is De Jure Regni Apud Skoros, which means like the the laws of rulership in Scotland among the Scots. And it basically explains that Scotland considered monarchs to be, or any form of government, all government to be conditional, and all loyalty to government. Like, all government authority is conditional, all loyalty to government authority is conditional. And, one instance when that was very plainly laid out was the Declaration of Arbroath in, I don't know if it was, basically like 1,000 years ago. It was, I believe, Robert the Bruce. I think it was Bruce. It might have been Wallace, but I think it was Robert the Bruce. And I think it was basically the document by which, essentially the covenant by which he was given conditional power by his supporters, by the people who had previously been partisans of Wallace against England. And they basically said, that a bunch of these leaders of the who supported Bruce, because at that time the English claimed control of Scotland, and they basically saw it as their vassal kind of colony, dependent or something, and they recognized as the King of England, the common, was it, forget his first name, but either the Red Common, I think, probably had red hair, and so surname is Common, probably Comyn, I believe, is probably related to the Cummins, like Cummings, Cummin. Those tend to be Scottish surnames. But the Red Common was loyal to the English. He basically was their puppet, you could say, in Scotland. And I don't know all the details, but basically Robert the Bruce killed him and took over and said, and basically kicked the English out of Scotland, certainly kicked, resisted English power over Scotland. And, but yeah, the Declaration of Arbroath, by which Robert the Bruce was basically given the allegiance of his supporters, states very clearly, I think it was a letter to the Pope, actually, because the Pope had essentially excommunicated Scotland because the Pope, had recognized the Red Common as the king, and they didn't recognize these kind of upstarts. And so yeah, basically Robert the Bruce was excommunicated. Scotland was essentially excommunicated, or at least the parts of it that were under his sway. So at Arbroath, they sent, they drew up a document to be sent to the Pope, and it was, basically saying, this is our king. We are the nation of Scotland. We choose this man as our king. And he, he's helping us to resist like the English tyranny, English imperialism. But if at any point he backslides in this and stops standing up for us, he will no longer be our king, and we'll find another who will do so. And so that's, I'm sure there were countless statements like that throughout the whole world, but that's one where it's in writing, and it's relatively early. Again, it was about 1,000 years ago, give or take a few centuries. I'm not exactly sure, but whenever Robert the Bruce was, so yeah, maybe 1300, 1200, 1100, don't know. But that tradition was passed on, what I would call the Whig tradition, what was known later as Whiggery in Scotland, was passed on generation to generation. And like John Mayer, who was a Scottish humanist philosopher, he wrote about that. He was influential, I think, in shaping the modern conception of Robin Hood, I believe it was. But he was a Scottish scholar, very accomplished. I think he was a professor in France. A lot of Scots lived in France. There was what we called the old alliance, or the Anciennist Alliance, or something, like basically Scotland and France were united against England. So, I mean, in a sense, all three places were dominated by the Normans, but the English were the most dominating of all. So, actually, so their fellow Normans basically were resisting them. Like, and including the English themselves, like the Anglo-Normans. With the Magna Carta was essentially Normans who were just resisting the tyranny of the king, but in the process they helped establish the traditions of human rights and democracy, even though they didn't. I mean, you can argue about what they were demanding, but what they were demanding was at least less tyranny. So that set a precedent. Sorry, and there was a very important Scottish component to that as well, because I believe King Alexander of Scotland supported the rebels, supported the Magna Carta barons or whoever, the leaders of the Magna Carta movement, and who were primarily in northern England, and actually shifted allegiance back and forth. Like some of those places where these Magna Carta leaders lived went back and forth between being considered part of England and being considered part of Scotland. So they're right around the border there. And so Alexander was very closely involved. I think he may have, I'm not sure if he sent soldiers to help or not, but he certainly used a lot of influence in helping the Magna Carta people. And so Magna Carta, I'm not super expert on. I know that laid down either habeas corpus or no taxation without representation. There was some kind of early rights that derived from it, some kind of challenge to just, royal autocracy. But John Mayer, again, he was this Scottish humanist philosopher, renowned throughout Europe, and he wrote about Scottish history, political history, and the right of people to resist tyranny. And he argued that was quintessential part of Scottish political tradition, and that it was an ancient human birthright, and that I think he argued that it was the original form of polity. Like democracy was essentially the original human society, and then steadily the elected rulers or whatever overstayed their welcome and usurped hereditary powers and the rest, and then we ended up with absolutism, basically. So he wrote about that. I'm not sure. I think it was maybe in his history of Scotland, or maybe it was just a history of Britain. And then I think he may have had an influence on who was it? George Buchanan. He may have been the teacher of George Buchanan, who was a later basically humanist that was I think they were basically contemporary, but Buchanan was younger. And so George Buchanan was, like, John Mayer was in Scotland right around the time of the Reformation, but he remained Catholic. Like, he was a humanist, and he was kind of like a Scottish Erasmus. So he was sympathetic probably to the Protestants. I don't think he was in favor of like suppressing, violent suppression, authoritarian suppression of them, but he himself remained Catholic. But he had a lot of the values that were carried into Protestantism into the Church of Scotland, including by George Buchanan, who I think might have been his pupil at some point in France or in Scotland. Yeah, maybe in Scotland, like at Aberdeen University or something. And or at St. Andrews. So George Buchanan wrote De jure apud reg, or de jure regni apud Scotus. So that was the book I mentioned earlier. That's basically, it's the law of governance among the Scots. So de jure regni apud Scotus gave like the history of Scotland, and it just showed how so many times people had problems with the king. They didn't like the king, and so they overthrew the king. And it just happened, pretty constantly throughout Scottish history. Like, we know, like, everybody knows, a lot of people know about the famous case of Macbeth, due to Shakespeare. And of course, in the Macbeth case, at least in the Shakespeare version, it's just purely kind of Machiavellian opportunism. But I think in Scottish history, there were a lot of other types of cases where, I'm not sure what the real Macbeth case was like, but there were a lot of cases where there was genuine disagreement with someone's mode of rulership, and therefore they were overthrown. And certainly that seems to have been the case with the Red Comyn and Robert the Bruce, because they disagreed over, bowing down to England, basically. And it's cool, like, how allergies just like randomly decide to kick in the middle of a video. They're like, hey, I bet you wanted me to appear right now. All right, well, trying to do this video. So the Scots, so yeah, he basically said that is the Scottish Constitution, essentially. I mean, you could say de jure regni apud Scotus essentially means the Scottish Constitution. It means like these are the laws by which Scottish government operates, and is essentially democracy. It's essentially saying all rulers are subject to the will of the people. They're subject to morality, and like, I think that he said certainly a lot of is either him or his kind of not predecessor, but his or not exactly protege, but I suppose like the next one in the line. Like I think for the leading Scottish theorists of resistance, you basically have John Mayer, then George Buchanan, and then Samuel Rutherford. So it was either Rutherford, Buchanan, or both. I think at least Rutherford wrote that public happiness is central and is part of the condition. And that might have even been included in the Arbroath Declaration, that basically if a king doesn't protect us and doesn't make us, as if they are not making the country happy, if they're not causing well-being in the country, and there's somebody else that can, then that other person essentially has the right and responsibility to take over and give the people what they deserve, a government that actually helps them, serves them. So Samuel Rutherford was later. I think John Mayer probably may have died around 1600, and George Buchanan may have lived to the early 1600s, and then Samuel Rutherford, his heyday was like in the early 1600s, and and he he was part of the revolution against the monarch. He helped, they overthrew Charles I, just as George Buchanan helped overthrow Mary Queen of Scots and establish basically a Protestant and more egalitarian, more democratic system there temporarily. But Samuel Rutherford, after Charles I was overthrown, there were a lot of okay, whatever. It's apparently this video is not meant to be because my allergies just were not in a they were not happening, and then they decided to happen right now in the middle of this video, in the middle of the night with the windows closed. So awesome. I'm just gonna take that as a sign from Satan to stop this video. But I'll just finish it up real quick and say that that allergies suck, and so Samuel Rutherford, basically they overthrew Charles I, and then a lot of people were complaining about it and saying, oh, you guys need to respect your king. And And they were saying basically that I think people were using religious arguments. Like there was somebody who was from basically the royal family that was writing, I think it was, or whoever it was. No, there's somebody in Scotland that I think was an Anglican or maybe Catholic priest, and they were writing against the revolution, and they were castigating it and saying that they were probably quoting the book of Romans to say that, you know, because the Bible, it says, like in the book of Romans, you have to do anything. If you're a slave and you ever disobey your master, you go to hell. Like that's in the book of Romans, basically. Like, so the Bible is very authoritarian, but somehow some relatively anti-authoritarian people still existed within Christianity. They just kind of veered away from the book of Romans and more towards, I'm not sure what, maybe the book of Revelations or something. So there was some book, yeah, I think there was some book written by a major Scottish, like maybe Anglican bishop or something against the revolution. And so Samuel Rutherford, who was a clergyman, as I'm not sure if George Buchanan had been a clergyman or not, but yeah, I think Rutherford was a clergyman, and he wrote Lex Rex, a book which was basically the law of the king. And it was essentially the same thing as De Jure Regni Apud Scotus. It was based largely on Scottish law. I think the full name probably was a similar concept, like the laws of the king in Scotland. And so he again showed throughout Scottish history that there had never been any reticence to overthrow a king if they were seen to be contrary to the will of the people. And so that was largely, that's the basis of liberalism, you know, like that. He was a leader of the movement called the Whigs, which eventually was renamed liberalism, but it was always kind of interchangeably called Whiggery, Whiggism, liberalism. And it was largely founded on this right of resistance, and particularly the right of revolution, and including the right of regicide, which a lot of the, especially Calvinists, had argued for. I think John Knox, the leader of the Scottish Calvinists, argued for the right of regicide against tyrants. And so, you know, that's the basis of the American Revolution. Like all, you know, everything that Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson were talking about was laid out already in this Whig liberal movement in Britain, which had this, you know, ancient historical backing in this tradition of resistance. In Scotland and in England too, there had been a lot of resistance. There was the Peasants' War, Peasants' Uprising with the Lollards. So the basic thing I will say that is the NAP, the libertarians are always talking about the NAP, the NAP, non-aggression principle, basically is that if you don't harm anybody, then nobody has a right to control anything you do or, you know, or harm you in any way. So that's obviously completely contrary to every government, because governments regulate all kinds of things that are just people's own personal business. But any government that violates the NAP, any government that tries to control you other than simply preventing you, like other than simply banning murder, banning rape, banning assault, obviously that's the point of government, to prevent these things. But once they start saying like, oh, I'm going to throw people in jail because they grew the wrong plant, or they walked down the street with a titty hanging out, or they had sex for money, or any other thing which is fully consensual acts between adults, that's tyranny. The government is the criminal. They're the ones violating your autonomy, and they should be removed. And it's our right to remove them, and it's our responsibility to remove them. So it's more, I guess I would say it's more a responsibility than it is a right. So yeah, like every government that exists right now on the earth is tyrannical. They all greatly overstep their bounds of the NAP, as I said. And for if anybody thinks the NAP is just some libertarian right-wing ploy or something, like, it's not. If you look in throughout the history of the left, the same concept has been stated a million times by almost everybody that was formative in the left. And I learned it myself from my communist aunt. She was the one who, most clearly inculcated that in me, and like most clearly articulated it. So that's the deal, like if somebody, like if there's a government that will arrest you and put you in jail or take your money because let's say you sell heroin. Okay. I'll say that because a lot of regular people support the laws against hard drugs. Like the average person now, I think, is for marijuana legalization, but they still think like the hard drugs, cocaine, meth, heroin, should be illegal. But Thomas Jefferson didn't think that. Benjamin Franklin didn't think that, and these things were not illegal. Like there was heroin, and there was cocaine, and all this stuff existed until eventually the Karens took over, and I mean, it's a strange thing, honestly. There's some people who argue kind of convincingly. I haven't really crunched the numbers enough to know, but they argue that it was that when women were given the vote, that they provided the numbers to ban alcohol and to ban all the drugs and stuff and start all these wars on drugs, because a lot of them were like Bible thumping school marms, and so yeah, I don't know. Be that as it may, I mean, it's great that everybody can vote, but it just goes to show that everybody sucks. Men vote for terrible stuff, and women do too. So yeah, the US government is tyrannical, it's unconstitutional, it's illegal. It's not technically, it's not the US government, because to be a government, you have to be constitutional and you have to be just. Like as soon as you are unjust, then you're a terrorist organization. You're no longer a valid government. That's the system that was taught, by George Buchanan, by Samuel Rutherford, by John Mayer, and by a lot of these people. So, yeah, our government's tyrannical. Even taxation, is not, like leftists worship taxation now for some reason, because they're too simple-minded to like understand money or government. But taxation is stupid. Like our governments literally create money. So it would be like, I don't know, like how are you going to do that? You create the money. Like if I create money and then I give it to you and then I ask for it back, like, I don't go, like, if I go to like the candy store, they don't ask me for candy. They don't say like, well, sure, we make candy every day by the, bucket load, but we can't really serve you candy unless you return the candy to us. So then we can just keep having candy. Like, but that's how stupid people are, that that would probably make sense to them. Like, that makes as much sense as what happens. So yeah, taxation, it doesn't exist so that they can have funds. They create money. They have no lack of funds. There's impossible for them to have a lack of funds. They literally can create any number. They just have to type it on the machine and they have that amount of money. And then people say, well, what about the debt and the fact that, we borrow money? But that's just the choice of the government. The government has the right to just create money and not borrow it. But the people in government sold that right to the banks in exchange for, I'm sure, a lot of kickbacks and bribes and stuff. So now they just are like, hey, yeah, sure, the government has every right to print endless amounts of money, but instead we're just going to give that right to these banks and then let them charge us for the privilege. The Federal Reserve is like disgusting. So yeah, taxation is a sham too. Taxation is totally, unjust. It might have made sense when money was gold and silver, because then, the government doesn't actually create gold and silver. So yeah, that might have made sense. What we have now has no, it's like so far from that. Like, people think, yeah, silver-backed currency is nothing like, this type of paper money that is not backed by anything. And therefore, I don't know. Do I need to go on about it? If you really think that it makes sense that the organization which created all the money that you have needs you to give it back to them at regular intervals, then bless your soul. Bless your poor dear soul. I will say that. So yeah, all these governments need to be overthrown. Every single one. But especially the US, simply because the US is the most powerful. But I would say Britain, Israel, Britain, US, Israel, they're basically all one government. And then BRICS, I guess China, Russia are kind of, maybe that's kind of one government. And it could be that, some people argue that China or Russia or both are basically controlled by the same people as control the US. And I would say that's truer than most people think. There's a lot more uniformity in the global power structure than people want to believe, or than people do believe. So, yeah. I'm not going to say how governments should be overthrown, or I'm not going to tell somebody to do so. Everybody has to know what their own capabilities are. Nobody should take risks that are irrational. I certainly, there's no reason to have failed revolutions just for the sake of resisting. But if there's ever a real chance to overthrow these tyrannical systems, we should do so. And the more people that are willing to do so, the more possible it will be. If it was everybody, then we would simply just say, you are no longer the government, and we refuse to, allow you or participate in anything that you do. but with less of it, it's more difficult. So yeah, we need to get as many people as possible to understand, like, we're past the point of the right of revolution. People need to understand the responsibility that if you live under a government that, paid Epstein, like,